Imagine the federal government ordering a major newspaper to stop pressing print, not over fake news, but over a massive secret war history. In June 1971, that is exactly what happened. The United States government asked federal judges to shut down an ongoing story in the New York Times. The documents were top secret. The Vietnam War was still raging, and the insider who exposed the files was facing a lifetime in prison. Could national security justify stopping the press before publication? The Supreme Court gave its answer just 15 days after the first court order halted the Times. But that famous ruling was far narrower and much more complicated than the headline it became. The story began with a secret history. In 1967, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara ordered an internal study of American decision-making in Vietnam. The project covered policy from 1945 through 1967. When completed, it filled 47 volumes and nearly 7,000 pages. Its official title was United States-Vietnam Relations, 1945-1967. The entire report was classified top secret, even though much of the underlying material was already public. This was not a tactical battlefield plan for 1971. It was a retrospective record of how the United States entered and escalated the war. Across multiple presidential administrations, the study revealed a persistent gap between private decisions and public explanations. Ellsberg had worked on part of the study. He was a former Marine officer, a Pentagon advisor, and had spent years analyzing the war in Vietnam. Working at the Rand Corporation, he read the full report. By then, he had turned completely against the war. In 1969, Ellsberg began secretly photocopying the papers, assisted by Anthony Russo. Ellsberg first tried to convince members of Congress to release the material. When that failed, he passed the documents to New York Times reporter Neil Sheehan in March 1971. On Sunday, June 13, the New York Times published the first installment. The Nixon administration moved swiftly. The very next day, the Department of Justice filed a lawsuit demanding an immediate temporary order to halt further publication. On June 15, a federal judge granted that order. For the first time in American history, the federal government had successfully muzzled a major national newspaper on national security grounds. But stopping one paper did not stop the truth. The Washington Post obtained its own copy of the documents and began publishing immediately. The government sued the Post as well. Judges in New York and Washington rushed through emergency hearings, reviewing classified evidence of the alleged harm publication would cause. With lower courts reaching conflicting decisions, the case raced upward at unprecedented speed. The Supreme Court accepted the emergency appeals on June 25, heard oral arguments the next day, and issued its ruling on June 30, just 6 days later. By a 6-3 vote, the court ruled against the government. The court's per curiam opinion was remarkably short. It stated that any system of prior restraint carries a heavy presumption against its constitutional validity. The government therefore bore a heavy burden to justify stopping the press. In this case, it had failed to meet that burden. The injunctions were lifted, the Times and the Post resumed publication. It was a monumental victory for press freedom. But it was not a blank check. All 9 justices wrote or joined separate opinions. They did not agree on a single uniform rule for future conflicts between secrecy and journalism. Some justices took an absolute stance against prior restraint. Others believed an injunction could be constitutional if publication posed a direct, immediate, and irreparable harm to the nation. Justice Byron White voted for the newspapers, yet issued a stern warning. Defeating an advance injunction did not shield publishers from criminal prosecution after publication. That distinction is critical. The Supreme Court decided whether the government could stop these newspapers in advance. It did not declare that every leak was legal. It did not grant immunity for publishing classified materials. And this certainly did not end the legal danger for the whistleblowers. Daniel Ellsberg was indicted in June 1971 on charges of theft and espionage. Anthony Russo was later charged alongside him. Their trial began in California in January 1973. Then, the government's own misconduct shattered its case. The trial judge revealed that a covert White House unit, known as the Plumbers, had broken into the office of Ellsberg's psychiatrist to steal damaging files. The FBI had also conducted illegal wiretaps that were withheld from the defense. In May 1973, Judge Matthew Byrne dismissed all charges with prejudice. It was not a jury acquittal, nor a ruling that leaking classified documents was legal. It was a judicial dismissal triggered by severe government misconduct. The Pentagon Papers case endures because it forces us to separate 3 fundamental questions. May a source be prosecuted for stealing secrets? May a news organization be punished after publishing them? And may the government stop the public from reading the news before a single word is printed? In 1971, The Supreme Court answered that last question with a powerful standard. Advanced censorship demands extraordinary proof, not just the label of top secret, and not a broad appeal to national security. 40 years later, the National Archives fully declassified and released the complete study. What was once guarded as a national secret became part of the permanent public record. The lasting lesson of the Pentagon Papers is not that government secrecy never matters. It is that secrecy cannot be its own evidence. When the state asks a court to silence the press, the burden belongs entirely to the government, and that burden is exceptionally heavy.